Most of us know the vital importance of the Amazon rainforest for the world. We have seen a lot of talk lately in the news about it, whether it's because of the raging fires that consumed more than 10,000 square kilometers back in 2020, or the constant deforestation that is rapidly increasing year after year. But have you ever stopped to consider the human aspect of the Amazon? On this video, we will be going back in time to explore an overlooked topic, its human biodiversity and the history of how greed almost wiped it out. This story begins with the rubber massacres of the Amazon that took place from 1880 to 1912 and left between 50,000 and 200,000 indigenous people dead, broke their culture, and displaced thousands more into the inhumane conditions of the rubber camps. Our goal is to explore how these camps were allowed to operate for more than 3 long decades, leaving behind a trail of blood and death. With the arrival of Colón, everything started to change within the American continent. Cities were founded, trade routes established, and the Spanish consolidated their domain over the whole region. Only a few places managed to remain unnoticed and were able to avoid all foreign contact. The Amazon was one of those places, a massive, dense, and inhospitable jungle that proved to be too much for the adventuring expeditions of the 16th and 17th centuries. Some of the conquistadores who dared to venture into the Amazon were decimated by the harsh conditions of the jungle. Disease like malaria, the extreme humidity and heat, and the difficulty to navigate through the dark, dense jungle was just too much for the Europeans. And because of that, the natives enjoyed, for at least 200 years, a relative safety from the pillaging and raving of the conquistadores. Only a few Portuguese traders managed to make contact, bringing them iron and steel tools in exchange for rare goods like cocoa, and some religious orders who tried to convert the Aboriginals into Christianity. These were nonetheless fleeting contacts that never managed to create a lasting European presence. With the arrival of the Enlightenment, the situation changed rapidly and Europe began a new age of exploration and conquest. This is exactly what happened to the Amazon in the 18th century. Scientists and natural philosophers started to take interest in the region with the aim of rediscovering it, in accordance with the new science for the sole purpose of its exploitation. One of the first scientific explorers to arrive to the continent was Charles Marie de la Condamine. He arrived in Quito by 1736, but on the way back to Europe he decided to cross through the Amazon from the Pacific to the Atlantic coast. It took him 4 long months to get from one side to the other. In this trip he took scientific measures that transformed the region into a known quantity. So, what was learned from his experience? First of all, that the Amazon basin was traversable and could be explored and colonized. Second, the Amazon had hundreds of plants. He gathered samples of quinine, cacao, vanilla, and rubber. Third, the Amazon had people in them, not civilized, but tribal Indians that could have been characterized as primitive, lazy, and prone to vice. Ignoring the fact that during this trip, the Indians were the ones who did all the hard work, such as carrying his luggage, building canoes, gathering supplies, and much more. It's important to clarify that nothing of what La Condamine brought to Europe was strictly new. The difference resided in the mindset of classifying and exploiting this new world. And how did rubber become fundamental to the industrial world? Well, it began with the findings and gatherings of explorers like Condamine, who pointed out the substance as waterproof, shapeable, and very versatile. There was no way that a material as such would remain unnoticed amongst the new intellectuals. Some of those examples arrived to Europe and were classified by scientists and academies in accordance with Linnaeus' taxonomy. Later on, chemists and inventors tried to refine the natural rubber so it could be more stable and withstand better the changes in temperature. Sometime forward, the Industrial Revolution would adopt rubber in its core. for seals in steam engines, waterproof clothing, indoor plumbing, rubbers, for pencils, and thousands of more applications. By the 1830s, the demand for rubber skyrocketed, and since the rubber trees only grew in the Amazon region, well, in consequence, the mighty jungle was dedicated exclusively to its production. Rubber camps began to emerge in Brazil because of the easy access to the river mouth and from there to the consumer's market in the US and Europe. But, with no end in sight for the rubber demand, soon those camps started moving upriver, and in a few years they could be found in every single country with land in the Amazon, Venezuela, Colombia, and Peru. By the 1880s, the bicycle boom in Europe and the emergence of the car industry forced the industrialized world to look for new sources of rubber to exploit. One of those regions was the Putumayo, where the Witoto, Bora, Ocaina, and Huiname lived, most of which had been, up to this point, largely ignored by the countries they inhabited, Peru and Colombia. The large concentration of Indians plus the huge quantities of the Castilla elastica tree proved to be the perfect opportunity for the rubber business to expand. Soon, little stations began to pop up all over the river banks of the big Amazon tributaries like the Putumayo, Napo, and Caquetá. But the Indians in the region had little to no contact with Europeans, so the appeal of trade did not lure them into working for the expeditions that ventured there. Because of that, violence and fear was used as the sole means to get the Indians to venture into the jungle and collect rubber for them. In the beginning, this task was extremely difficult as the jungle was immense and the Indians could, and often did, just disappear into it. But all of that would eventually change with the rise of the Arana House. This enterprise was founded by Julio Cesar Arana in the Peruvian town of Iquitos. Soon, he began to acquire all the small camps in the region either with money or by force. By 1900, it was one of the biggest rubber companies in the world, controlling all the chain of production from its source to the industrial centers in New York and London. Their operation was simple but effective. First, Las Conquistadas, in which a group of heavily armed men assaulted the Indian villages in a radius in order to bring them to the stations. Second, the families were separated. The men were sent out to work while women and children were kept as hostages. Third was a process called the fabrico, in which the man had to bring a set amount of rubber in 3 months' time. In the business structure of the Arana House, the captains of the station worked together in a network that assured them total control over the Putumayo. This meant that the Indians were always accounted for in the station's ledger and often were branded with iron, drastically reducing the number of Indians that vanished into the jungle. Over time, numerous reports started to arrive in Europe and the US about the brutality of the rubber camps in the Putumayo. But these were almost always ignored. The Amazon was a distant and insignificant region. The rubber that came from it was of extreme importance, and the Arana company swore that their methods were aimed to civilize and make the Indians useful. The Indians endured all kinds of tortures and massacres for the next 10 years, while none of the countries that profited from the rubber trade showed any kind of consideration for them. But the constant reports of the massacres and mistreatments in the Putumayo began to backlash on the British government, especially since by this date the Arana Company was established in London and had numerous British investors. On the 23rd of July of the year 1910, the British Foreign Office finally decided to appoint someone to investigate the disturbing allegations against the Arana House. This person was Sir Roger Casement, a British consul who had previously investigated and denounced the massacres of the Belgian Congo. Initially, the Commission's goal wasn't to investigate the forced labor allegations, but look at the excess of brutality in the so-called effort of civilizing the Indians, not for their sake, but because of how that would reflect on the British Empire. This attitude can be seen in the early remarks of Casemente's notes as he started the month-long journey to the Putumayo in a steamboat. All we can hope for is to see that these devilish things are no longer occurring, and that steps can be taken to ensure they shall not recur. All the region has rubber, but no labor save its Indian tribes, and the only means of starting labor is to force the Indians to work. As his journey brought him to the different stations in the Putumayo, he soon realized that these rubber camps were not a civilization effort that could be redeemed. In the Devil's Paradise, Casamentes saw the following: disciplinary cepos, in which Indians were left for days in the hot sun and rain. No payment or trade for the rubber, as the station store did not have enough goods. Almost all of the Indians showed sign of being whipped, even the children. The wives and daughters of the Indians were abused by the company's men. After traversing this evil enterprise that supplied the world with rubber, the council concluded: before the white man came, they were stronger and handsomer too, and perhaps the healthiest people in the world. Venereal disease, smallpox, and other ills we have bestowed, along with the weals and wealths of this outrageous fortune we drag from them, were formerly unknown. They grew old. There are no old people now. The Indians who actually preferred their forest freedom to the whip, the cepo, the bullet, and the raping of their children are spoken of in terms of reprobation as lazy, idle, and worthless. And these by men who never leave their hammock all day, and whose only work is to work crime. Their only use, their sole purpose, is to terrorize and rob. The report from the council showing the inhumane conditions of the camps soon started to make wave in the US and UK. The English investors of the Arana Company pulled out, and in a matter of months, the English branch dissolved because of the outrage. Julio César Arana, the robber baron, was examined by the British Parliament in 1913, with triumphant headlines claiming that Arana comes to face the music. In the hearings, Arana denied everything and stated that his company was no longer British and that he himself was a citizen of Peru, which meant that the British courts could not judge him. And that was that. The outrage eventually was forgotten. 1 year later, World War I started and the rubber kept flowing without anyone wondering how it was produced. The British eventually succeeded in domesticating the rubber tree and stole over 26,000 seeds from Brazil, planting them in Malaysia and effectively breaking the Amazon's monopoly on the rubber production. In the end, Arana's bloody business was affected, but by no means destroyed. As late of the 1930s, there were reports of Indians being forcibly displaced and kept working in the dreadful conditions of that camp. The man himself never faced the music, as the British papers once predicted. He died in 1952, a rich and powerful man. As for the tribes of the Putumayo, they lost almost half of their population, up to 200,000 by some accounts. Their culture was broken by the Holocaust, and many wandered to the Peruvian and Colombian cities to live in squalor and poverty. Some eventually returned to the lands of their forebears, where they have tried ever since to rebuild their society, broken with impunity by greed. So we ask ourselves, who is to blame for the massacres in the Putumayo? The rich countries that profited from the trade, or the Peruvian and Colombians that enslaved the Indians? All of the people that profited from these atrocities sooner or later chose to ignore them as the evidence mounted. This was because they benefited from the rubber trade, either directly or indirectly as consumers. What this story showed us is that the industrial system that used rubber did not work towards stopping the atrocities, but instead chose to shift blame to one part of the problem, the Arana Company, liberating everyone else from any guilt, but without fixing the problem of the exploitation of their fellow human beings. We suffer from the same issues today. We consume in a globalized world, but almost never question the way those products are made. So, next time, spare a thought for the work conditions of the people that make your everyday life possible. Thank you for watching.